The new book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, tells the story of how undercover U.S. intelligence agents use drugs to target leftist leaders from SDS to the Black Panthers, Young Lords, and even the Occupy movement. It also tells how they particularly targeted leftist musicians, including John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, Tupac Shakur, to promote drugs while later murdering them as they started to sober up. And goes into details about how agents dosed, gave LSD to Mick Jagger, got Elvis involved. Just in a compelling story. The author is John L. Potash. He's also the author of the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders.
Thanks so much, Alan.
You're very welcome. Talk about how you came upon this and how long you've been working on it. And
Sure.
in essence, what I said in the introduction, give a little bit of a summary on that.
Sure. Yeah, so I was working as a drug and alcohol counselor in Baltimore around 1990 when someone I was counseling said his father was a Black Panther killed by the police. And at the time, I was writing more fiction and was developing a book on the theme of drugs as weapons against us, but from a novel standpoint. And so I started researching the Black Panthers based on what he told me, and I found that the leading Panthers in the New York area were the Shakurs, and that then all of a sudden, a year or two later, this Tupac Shakur rises up as this black rapper, icon, superstar, and his parents, his mother, Afeni Shakur, was a one-time leader of the Harlem Black Panthers, and strange police foul play started to come up around his life. So I started writing more about him in particular and got away from the novel with the theme of drugs as weapons against us. Ended up turning that into the book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, because his lawyer, his New York trial lawyer, Michael Warren, gave me a long interview saying, I think that the police are targeting Tupac like they targeted his Black Panther parents, and he gave me all, about a 2-hour interview of why. And it was very hard to publish an article like that at the time because there was so much kind of smearing of Tupac, and he actually had developed a plan to pretend to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. It was part of his Black Panther Extended Families plan that was working across the country. They were getting the Bloods and Crips in Los Angeles to call peace truces and turn on to activism. That was spreading throughout California, and then they and other activists, including Tupac and Harry Belafonte and others, were getting those peace truces and turn on to activism to happen across the country, to the point in New York the Young Lords, the Latino version of the Black Panthers, got the Latin Kings to stop drug dealing and turn on to activism. And so this was, this got to be a major motive for U.S. intelligence to be concerned about Tupac because he was getting so influential. And so that became the first book. But at the same time as I was writing that, I was reading books on John Lennon, for example, as you mentioned. And I found that this British lawyer named Fenton Bressler, had wrote in this book, Who Killed John Lennon, and he was also a crime reporter for the London Daily newspaper. And after a 7-year investigation, he found that the CIA assassinated John Lennon when he sobered up and was getting back into activism and, coming out with his next 2 albums. And so, I just started exploring that more. Then I explored Jimi Hendrix's death, and within the last few years, a roadie that worked with Jimi Hendrix said that Jimi Hendrix's manager, who was former MI6, which is British CIA, admitted when he was drunk to having Hendrix killed. And so, and then of course, with Kurt Cobain, you might have heard about the recent film that came out, Soaked in Bleach, which shows all the evidence that he was actually murdered and didn't commit suicide. And I ended up researching Kurt Cobain also. So
wow, so many interesting things. In fact, I know about that movie. They actually use audio from my shows I did with Tom Grant.
I saw that. I heard that in the movie. Yeah.
Yeah. So but I gotta tell you, it's just I think if you try to explain to people how the government might have been involved in drugs in their own way. For example, the CIA's use of drugs to target activists. I remember Frank Zappa telling me on one of my first interviews that the CIA was giving out the LSD to hippies in San Francisco, or I guess the Bay Area back in the 60s, at the same time busting them at night. And then 60 Minutes did something on this. Is this kind of what you're talking about?
It is, exactly. Because the CIA had an operation called MK Ultra that started in the 50s, and it was a huge operation. It started as Artichoke and then Bluebird, and then became MK Ultra, and there was many sub-operations under MK Ultra. And it ran at least until the early 1970s, when Richard Helms had all the documents he could possibly find shredded. But luckily, some of the documents, about 30,000 of them, were saved in the finance department, or he didn't realize were in the finance department. So some of those documents, those 30,000, still came out. And so that shows some of the evidence of it. And there was many more documents than just 30,000 documents, because it was very long running. But that operation was exploring drugs, the use of drugs as weapons. And it's known, it came out in New York Times and other places, that they had psychedelic hit lists. They were going to try to dose Castro and Che Guevara and Nasser of Egypt and people like that to undermine their credibility. But there's a number of studies. They used acid and many other drugs on Edgewood Arsenal soldiers and tested how it affected them, including tests 20 years later. And so tests 20 years later had a core of them saying, I still feel like I have long-lasting negative effects from LSD. Now, the CIA knew this from testing them on just more than the soldiers. They tested them on prisoners and many other people. Mm-hmm. But they could tell, that it had some negative effects. But it allowed them to manipulate people that used a lot of LSD. It hurt people that used LSDs, in other ways in terms of their competency. According to William S. Burroughs, says he thinks it hurts people's competency. But the key is that it undermined the best abilities of these activists, like the Students for Democratic Society and others that were fighting against the Vietnam War, were trying to stop the Vietnam War. And so by doing that, they could really make the anti-war protesters less effective. And so by targeting musicians now, A.E. Hotchner was Ernest Hemingway's longtime editor, and he came out with a book called Blown Away about the Rolling Stones. In that book, he says that in 1965, the assistant deputy director of the CIA, Robert Lashbrook, was in London getting LSD into as many musicians' hands as possible. He had agents trying to get musicians in London to use LSD. Okay, and so why was he doing that? And why did Hotchner also interview an agent that was part of that, and find that out? And as you said, Mick Jagger's first hit of LSD came from an undercover FBI agent that came out in London daily newspapers. The reason is, I argue, is because they were using them as role models, just like getting LeBron James to wear Nike, to get kids to wear Nikes. That would make acid more popular. Now, when Brian Jones, and they did that with Brian Jones, I argue, but when Brian Jones started sobering up, then they watched him more closely on what he was going to do next. Now, they also framed Mick Jagger right after giving him his first hit of acid, so they got him under their legal thumbs, and they did the same with Jones, and they refused Jones a passport and a visa to come out of Britain to tour when the 1968 Rolling Stones tour in America. So Jones was disconnected from the Stones at that point. Jones was the founder of the Rolling Stones, the best musician. He was good friends with Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon. He called Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon and asked them if they wanted to form a supergroup at that time, and they said yes, according to Hotchner. And Hotchner quotes a member of the Guinness family who was close friends with Brian Jones, who said that one day Jones sent me to town to pick up a friend to bring back to his house. He tries to come back to his house, and all of a sudden there's a party at his house. He didn't know why. There wasn't supposed to be a party. He couldn't get into the driveway. And he goes around the back, and he's looking at the swimming pool, and he sees a group of people drowning a man in the swimming pool, in Brian Jones' swimming pool. And it turns out that was Brian Jones, but somebody pops out of the bushes and says, you better get out of here and not say anything, or you'll be next. And he identifies the Guinness family members by name. And that guy was scared to death. But that was Brian Jones. He was drowned in his own swimming pool, despite them saying he accidentally drowned in his own swimming pool.
Did the other members of the Stones know it was something tied to the CIA? I mean, did they know?
Yeah, Keith Richards' quote was, he says, "We couldn't get to the bottom of it." He says, "Brian was an excellent swimmer. He's seen him, swimming in waves up, breakers up to here, And so it's like the JFK situation. You can't get to the bottom of it. It's all muddled, and we can't get any information on it. And so they knew something was up. They didn't know exactly what. But then murder contracts came out for Mick Jagger, according to a Hells Angel who testified in court under the Witness Protection Program. He said there was murder contracts when the Hells Angels was trying to kill Jagger, and this was the Oakland Hells Angels, who an ATF agent had testified in court, saying that we gave murder contracts to the Oakland Hells Angels to kill Cesar Chavez and Eldridge Cleaver, the Minister of Information for the Black Panthers nationally. So this is some of the stuff that was going on, that when they tried to sober up, when they stopped promoting drugs, or when they got more into activism, because Jones and Jagger were the most, voiced the most opposition to the Vietnam War. They had also attended some anti-war rallies, and that was a huge concern, of course, for U.S. intelligence and British intelligence. So, and Hendricks, in the last year of his life, had gotten very politically active against the Vietnam War. He had planned to call Bob Dylan to get him active with him. And according to Hendricks's fiancée Monica Danneman, and his manager Mike Jeffries was, as I say, former MI6, but everyone knows that that's the British CIA. Everyone knows that CIA is a lifetime. You don't just leave and you're never part of it again. It's the same with MI6, they say. And so his manager, 48 hours within Hendricks firing his manager, he's found dead. But Hendricks had said that his manager tried to sabotage him every time he tried to do political benefits, and he wouldn't let him do political benefits. He finally did a benefit, and his manager, Jeffrey, dosed his drink with a super psychedelic, and he couldn't play right, and he ended it early. Jeffrey also had him kidnapped by some mafia, he believes, and then freed him with larger mafia after several days. Just incredible. And the U.S. intelligence had him, according to some documents, under 24-hour surveillance, Jimi Hendrix.
So they would befriend the band would think they're just fans, and then they give them the drugs. Is that how they introduce themselves into the lives of these rock stars?
Well, with someone like Mike Jeffrey, he was, he inserted himself as Jimi Hendrix's manager. Someone like with the Rolling Stones, that undercover FBI agent, his name was David Schneiderman. They also called him David Jove. He went under different aliases. But he just befriended Keith Richards. He had tons of drugs on him all the time. At that party where they framed Mick Jagger, he had a briefcase full of different drugs, including the acid that he gave to Jagger. But the police came and arrested everybody but, Dave Jove. And they wouldn't look. He says, I got a roll of film in my suitcase so you can't open it up. And they said, oh, that's fine. So they let him go. They didn't look in his briefcase with all the drugs in it. So that's the way it's done. They befriend people. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of connections in different ways from different sources. Usually intelligence sources, of course, because they're intelligence. And they worm their ways into their lives. It appears.
This is an explosive new book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the new one from John Potash, and you can go to johnpotash.com for more details. So while they're supplying the drugs, the CIA, they're also manipulating the manufacturing of drugs also? Were they kind of creating the drug, the pipeline, so to speak?
Yeah. With acid, it came out that the top trafficker of LSD in the world was a man named Ronald Stark. And several very good sources came out with this. An Italian judge, an Italian commission, a governmental commission came out with this report that Ronald Stark had been working for the United States Secret Services since 1960. A high-level police detective in Britain uncovered the ring that was working underneath Ronald Stark and said that Ronald Stark was trafficking vast amounts of LSD on different. He had laboratories on different continents, and he was in jail for a brief period before they let him out. But Ronald Stark was the largest LSD trafficker in the world, and he was part of U.S. intelligence. Another man, Augustus Owsley Stanley III, just known as Owsley, was working under Ron Stark at one point with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Now, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love was financed by the Mellon Hitchcocks. And the Mellon Hitchcocks, you might remember Mellon of Mellon Bank, and that family also owned Gulf Oil. They were some of the wealth. It was one of the wealthiest families in the world. So it was a brother and sister team. It wasn't just some renegade one guy from the family, but it was a brother and sister team. William and Peggy Mellon Hitchcock financed the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Now, the Mellons were also very involved in U.S. intelligence, and they financed that group for years. So, I mean, we're really decades, and that's just some of the many, pieces of evidence of U.S. intelligence LSD trafficking.
I remember when I was a kid growing up and hearing how the Nixon administration was targeting rock musicians, John Lennon in particular at the time. I guess that all goes along with this. They they really felt that the rock culture was a threat.
Yeah, U.S. intelligence documents just outline different tactics for targeting political musicians, including using drugs and sex to entrap, and a number of tactics that show that all of them were used on Tupac Shakur because he was actually head of a group called the New African Panthers when he was 17 and 18 years old, which was a national group trying to replicate the Black Panthers. So he was already a national black leader before he became a rapper and took on this fake gangster persona. As I said, in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. So they had their eye on him very early on. But I show how all of these different tactics that they outline in this government document about using, tactics to undermine musicians was used on him. But you can argue, you could show a lot of these tactics were used on each of these musicians.
And Janis Joplin, they got her hooked on speed? Yeah,
a guy who admitted to one friend that he was working for the FBI became the fiance of Janis Joplin and got her hooked on speed. He was also dealing in arms with Algeria. He had all kinds of activities that showed he was high-level intelligence in some way, shape, or form besides just FBI. And got her hooked on speed, and she finally found out that he had a whole family in another state and, got away from him, but not before she ended up, ragged out on speed. And then she, of course, developed a heroin problem. She actually rejected acid, though, but the heroin problem, was something she was trying to get rid of too. And she had promised to do some of the first major anti-war concerts. They were going to be held in Philadelphia, first in New York, and then in Philadelphia in stadiums. She announced it on, I think it was the Dick Cavett show, and before she held her first concert against the war that was going to raise huge money for the anti-war movement, she got a hot shot, an overly pure dose that killed her instantly. And it's, her sister said, I think, that the CIA did this, but it is a known CIA tactic to give a hot shot to make a murder look like an accidental death.
Yeah, wow. And this is really strange. The connection to Nazis in the CIA and the cocaine drug lords and genocide. I want to later go back to Kurt Cobain and
Sure.
maybe John Lennon and some of the other stories. But let's talk about this part of history.
Yeah, well, it's mostly contained in the first chapter about how that came to be, that collaboration, about the eugenics movement and all, but basically the wealthiest families in the United States, the Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans, and the Rockefellers started the eugenics movement, which passed laws in a majority of the states in the country that were incredibly bigoted against all ethnic populations and called for sterilization and death at birth of inferior genes. It was this ludicrous pseudoscience. And thankfully went out of vogue before, with the World War II Nazis, but they also funded the rise of the Nazis, according to Edwin Black, a syndicated Los Angeles Times columnist who wrote award-winning books like IBM and the Holocaust, and his book that focused on eugenics was called War Against the Weak. It's been translated in dozens of different languages. It's incredible documentation of it all. But so after World War II, it's come out in the New York Times in the last few months that we saved thousands of Nazis. Okay, U.S. intelligence saved thousands of Nazis. Numbers differ between 5 and 10,000, however many. But under Operation Paperclip, we saved Nazi scientists and brought them in. And one of the biggest programs we brought them into was MK Ultra, Why? Because they were already testing psychedelics on concentration camp survivors.
I see, yeah.
Concentration camp victims. They were testing all kinds of drugs, but particularly psychedelics on concentration camp victims. And so people like Professor Alfred McCoy names like a guy named Plotner, who was a Nazi scientist, and there's other Nazi scientist names I have, Strughold and people like that. But they were part of Operation MKUltra, and they guided it a lot. So they became assets in the U.S., but thousands of Nazis were also sent down to Latin America to, sadly enough, organize things down there, and I show the evidence. Professor Peter Dale Scott did great documentation on the trafficking of cocaine by U.S. intelligence, by the CIA and all, but particularly also with the aid of the Nazi assets down in Latin America, including the Nazi asset Klaus Butcher of Leon Barbie, who helped kill Che Guevara, and they helped with cocaine coups that were called in 1980. The Bolivian takeover of the government was called the cocaine coup, and that's some of what happened down there.
Wow. The book Drugs as Weapons Against Us, investigative journalist and author John L. Potash is with us. Now, going back to Kurt Cobain, what was the problem? What were they? Kurt Cobain was going to have something on an album cover that upset them. Why would they target him?
Yeah, well, he was considered the John Lennon of his generation. I mean, everyone's heard that before.
Sure.
But he had the politics of John Lennon. That's one of the issues that they had. They had a problem with him, was he was very leftist, and he had a problem with he was pro-abortion rights. He was pro-gay rights. He was anti hyper-capitalism. He was. Now, the essays he wanted to have inside Nevermind, he said in a biography that came out before his death, were anarchistic essays, about the way politics is, about how to revolt, how to make your own bomb and stuff. And so he said this in a biography by Michael Azerrad. I think it was called "Come as You Are." It came out before his death, and that album sold 30 million copies. And so to have those kinds of essays, and so he said, well, we better hold off on it until we get more popular, when we can have more effect with these kinds of essays. And so if he ever came out with essays like that in his albums that were so popular, it would have been concerned. But but he'd be 47 or 48 years old today, and he would still be having an effect over the hearts and minds of the populace. And because he was that kind of figure, he was that super popular figure, and that's a concern. The CIA wants to control our hearts and minds. Now,
was Courtney Love involved in any of this that you can see?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think Tom Grant did a great investigation. I mean, I know you had him on your show, and I think he lays out a lot of evidence, and he stumbled upon this. I'm pretty sure he said he didn't even know who Kurt Cobain was before he was hired by Courtney Love.
That's right.
Yeah, and did you want to say something else?
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, he this was just to him a cut and dry murder, and he couldn't let it go. Right.
Right. So Courtney Love hired him a few days before Kurt Cobain died, and so he goes and investigates, and he finds all kinds of foul play by Courtney Love in the death of her husband. And he finds he has he tapes most of his talks and telephone talks and even in-person talks, and he talked to Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love's lawyer, Rosemary Carroll, who said he was divorcing her at the time of his death, and they were hateful towards each other, and they had a prenuptial agreement when they first got married, so she was going to get virtually nothing. Now, and so he does a great job of showing all the evidence that Cobain was murdered and Courtney Love had something to do with it. Someone came on different talk shows passing polygraph tests, a guy named Eldon Hoke, who said that Courtney Love offered me $50,000 to blow her husband's head off and make it look like a suicide. He also said that for the movie Kurt and Courtney, that Nick Broomfield had a movie on. Now, a few days after he did that, he was filmed saying that for Nick Broomfield, for Kurt and Courtney. He died mysteriously. And so I argue, and he passed 2 polygraph tests with the top polygrapher, Edward Gelb, and we passed beyond possibility of deception, this guy, Eldon Hoke. And so that Courtney Love had tried to get him to be part of this, murder. So I investigated Courtney Love, and I talked to her biological father, and I saw the memoir of her mother and biographies on her. And this is a very, it's the part of the book that is kind of, people could be skeptical about, and I would understand. But it's unbelievable. Courtney Love's life was unbelievable. She was a teenage prostitute. By about 16 years old, she was prostituting herself to the Assistant Secretary of Defense, David Packard, according to her biological father, Hank Harrison. In another biography, she said she was prostituting herself to Army generals in Alaska. She was prostituting herself to Asian mafia, and she's going over to Taiwan, according to one biography by Melissa Rossi. It's incredible what she was doing. She was also, at the age of 16, she brought over 1,000 hits of acid to Dublin when she stopped off to see her father when he was doing research there, and then took it. Now, her father says she traveled. Some CIA agents met with her in Dublin at his house, and traveled with her to Manchester, where she gave it out like candy, acid, to musicians. And she ended up doing the same thing in Portland and the same thing in Los Angeles. She had all these drugs and incredible quantities of drugs. So she was carrying out the same kind of operations as MK Ultra as a teenager. And why was it just coincidence that the CIA agents were traveling with her while she was doing some of this?
So she was working with them knowingly.
Well, it's hard to know what was going on in her mind because her mind was so messed up. Now, she had written a letter to to Hank Harrison, her father, saying that her counselors were giving her Tuinals and Secanols, and they were also having sex with her as a little kid. And her mother even admitted that there was probably some child abuse in one of her child care facilities when she was still a toddler. Now, as a counselor, I work with people with dissociative identity disorder,
right?
Which is what's multiple personality disorder, what used to be called. And when you cause child abuse or sex abuse from the age of 7 under, you can split people's minds and really mess up their minds. When you also give them the MK Ultra drugs, which are psychohypnotics like Tuinals and Secanols, you can control them, and you can hypnotize them easier, you can control them easier. And I just argue that's possible because other people have given federal testimony to this, that MK Ultra had used them as prostitutes and to orchestrate murders by prostituting with these same kinds of drugs and the same kind of sex abuse and child abuse when they were about 5, 6, and 7 years old. And so I show the source of that video of the federal testimony and show her the evidence that she went through all this as a kid. Her mother actually abandoned her and left her. She ended up in a juvenile detention facility when she got her biological father, Hank Harrison, to come pick her out of there at about 13 or 14 years old, and that's when all this happened. So it can be argued that she was manipulated and just doesn't even realize fully everything she's doing, but this is what she is. She's just a junkie, sadly enough, prostitute who's being manipulated by U.S. intelligence.
This is another thing. The police supervisor told officers not to investigate Cobain's death as a murder.
Right.
And then was it that police detective or supervisor was later murdered?
Yeah, what happened was, one of the officers that was investigating the death of Kurt Cobain told Wallace and Halperin, the authors of 2 good books
right.
on Cobain's death, Love and Death and Who Killed Kurt Cobain. They said that this officer said that our supervisor told us not to investigate as anything but a suicide. Everything else would just be for show. And so so one of these officers that was on that team that was supposed to be investigating the death, a guy named Detective Antonio Terry, bucked his supervisor and spent 100 hours investigating it as the source of the heroin and investigating it as a possible murder. And he ended up being the first police officer killed in about 7 to 8 years in the Seattle police force. And the person who killed him identified him, knew he was a cop. And he was in plain clothes, Detective Terry, so he knew he was a cop anyway. He knew his path home, and so it's very suspicious. Yeah,
unbelievable. And why would they be interested in Occupy Wall Street? I guess I could see why they're interested. So they're still today doing these operations. It
appears that way. I just lay out the evidence because someone who did a film about this, they called it MK Occupy. suggesting that it's still MK Ultra tactics used on the Occupy movement. But Fenton Bressler's book came out in 1980. Of course, he came out in 1987 because Lenin died in 1980 and was murdered in 1980. And they said that they shredded all those documents and ended MK Ultra in 1972 or 73. Fenton Bressler showed all his evidence that they were still using these MK Ultra tactics up until Lenin's murder in 1980. And so what I show also in one chapter is the fact that some of the same associates of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love that Ronald Stark was a part of were still caught dealing in tens of millions of hits of acid as of 2000, 2001. A guy named William Picard had incredible connections around the world, including the U.S. government, when he was caught with that much acid in a missile silo of all things. He had a laboratory in a nuclear missile silo. And so there's just internal struggle between DEA agents trying to catch these people and other U.S. intelligence figures that are continuing some of these operations.
Unbelievable piece of work. In finding this information and reporting on this information, you're a brave man. How do you, I don't know what ramifications can happen from this, but I guess if you get the word out, people will know if anything does happen. Well, your thoughts on that?
Well, it's scary, yeah, but I just want to get the word out and hope that other people run with it. It's and it saves. I hope it saves people. Because look, I spent over 25 years working with people with mental health issues and addictions.
Right.
And I'm so tired of seeing this, doing it one by one. I want to help people on a big scale and warn them, like, look, you're being duped. Enjoy the sex and the rock and roll without the drugs,
Right, and this drug war in itself is just absurd, how that continues to this day. And you've been counseling and working with people in mental health issues and addiction for over 25 years, but you just couldn't resist this compelling story and information. Right. Even Elvis Presley? God, talk about that.
Yeah, it's interesting with Elvis. People are often asked, they're a little surprised about Elvis because the fact that you got to understand, in the early 1950s, it was a whole different world. And here's this guy, Elvis, coming out and loving black musicians and popularizing black music to the white community that was incredibly segregated. And Elvis went to black concerts all the time. He loved black musicians. He emulated them. But a guy named John Trudell, who was head of the American Indian movement, who went through horror himself for being head of the American Indian movement, he ended up losing his whole family. His whole house was burned down. It was terribly sad. But he ended up leaving his activism when he lost his whole family and turned on to music. And Jackson Browne produced his first album, Graffiti Man, and one of his songs was called Baby Che, and it was about Elvis Presley. And he argued that Elvis Presley was like the Che Guevara for men's emotions in the 1950s. He felt like Elvis freed us men to express our emotions so deeply and so intensely. And that's what I think why U.S. intelligence started a file on him as early as the mid-1950s. And I show some of those FBI documents on him. And so when Elvis was still 21 years old, he couldn't handle his success. It was just so huge. He couldn't handle all the booking and all that. So all of a sudden, a guy named Colonel Tom Parker comes into his life. And he was one of the highest-ranking National Reserve members you could be. Mm-hmm. And the National Reserve has often been used for special operations for assassinations. But here comes this Colonel Tom Parker, who proceeds to give him uppers and downers regularly, gets him hooked on that stuff, and then convinces him, and they draft Elvis, obviously. Plenty of researchers on MKUltra show that MKUltra was very big in Germany. After the World War II, MKUltra was being used for all kinds of experiments in Germany. And he gets over to Germany. He gets more hooked on the drugs. He's got a group of people around him that they call the Memphis Mafia eventually, who are constantly encouraging the drug use, not trying to stop the drug use. And Colonel Tom Parker doesn't let him do another concert for 10 years. He didn't do a live concert after he was drafted. And people like John Lennon were interviewed right after Elvis's death, and Lennon said, you've been hounding me to say something about Elvis. I think Elvis died when he went into the Army, and after that he was just the living dead. And so they proceeded to control the rest of his life, and of course he died of drug-related complications. But at the time when he first got big at 21, he was young people loved him. They would throw rocks through the windows of a radio station saying, "If you don't play Elvis," because they were censoring him around the country, "if you don't play Elvis, we're going to tear this town apart." And so he really was, in a kind of an emotional revolutionary in that way, and he always maintained that I am not the king of rock and roll. People like Bo Diddley and people like that and B.B. King are the kings of rock and roll, and he was so anti-segregation, and so for his time, he was really radical to be so anti-segregation.
It's so fascinating because he wanted to be a narcotics agent. He pretended to be, and that's how he asked President Nixon, right, to give him a special citation where he's now got the authority to bust people or something.
By that point, he was so controlled and manipulated and such a shell of himself, according to John Lennon and other people.
Yeah. Oh, man, this is a compelling book. What a really one of those stories where we're going to have to do a part 2, John. Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, Alan.
It's John L. Potash, Potash, his second book, brand new, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And when you say us in the title, you're talking about the rock culture, the youth culture? Yeah. People left of center?
Right. And so the subtitle is The CIA's Murderous Targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and Other Activists. But I do mean all of us, really, because we all get duped. We got duped into, thinking like drugs are the normal way to socialize and have fun.
Unbelievable.
Thanks a lot,
johnpotash.com is the website. Let's continue this. Thank you for being on the Alan Handelman Show, John.
You're very welcome, Alan. Thanks again for having me on.
You're very welcome.
Take care now.